I will just get this going. So thank you very much for having me. This is very exciting, and I'm really pleased to see some. Oh, sorry, this is
No, you're fine. We can see your screen. I think you just need to start your presentation, and we should all be good.
Okay. Are you seeing the full screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Fantastic. Away you go.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. So thanks very much for having me, and I'm glad to see quite a few names that I recognise of the attendees there today, especially Meryl, who I did a talk last week, and Meryl sadly couldn't make it in, and I was devastated because a lot of what I've done is Meryl has kind of coached me into. So it's really great to see Meryl's here as well. So it's quite a short talk, obviously, and I'm really going to do the basics. But as I said, I actually did a talk last week for NOSAS, and if you want to hear a slightly longer version of my quite nasal voice going on about this, you can get that on NOSAS's YouTube channel. So what I'll talk about today is basically what my research has been, and what sort of evidence I'm using, and what it is I'm actually recording. And I'm going to try and give you a kind of an indication of the archaeological variety among the archaeology of distilling in the Highlands and Islands. So yes, my PhD is in the archaeology of whisky distilling in the Highlands and Islands, and that breaks down into a few sort of categories. If you want to categorize it, you can have people distilling privately in their own homes. You can have people distilling illicitly in ways that flout regulations or are illegal. You can have distilling that's happening as a sort of satellite activity to a farm, and that's something that can sort of really enrich agriculture as well. And you can also have the large whiskey distilleries that we're probably all more familiar with today. But it's a good idea not to get too bogged down into those categories because they're quite messy. And they don't necessarily follow a sort of a teleological line. There's a lot of overlap. What we'll talk today is mainly about illicit distilling. The flouting of laws and regulations in whiskey, it kind of happens for as long as there are regulations regarding whiskey. And the first of those are in the 1640s. But what we tend to think of as the main time of widespread illicit distillation is from the 1780s, when a Wash Act introduced a line going through the Highlands, through from the Sound of Jura up to around Findhorn. And it really created the perfect conditions for smuggling to flourish, and it became an endemic problem, but also a way of life in the area. And then in 1823, the Excise Act came in and went some way to curb illicit distillation. But there's plenty of evidence, archaeological and historical, to let us know that actually illicit distilling went on way into the 19th century and beyond, as I've discovered to my delight. So what is a distilling site? Well, obviously, a place where whiskey's being made. But what makes these illicit distilling sites rather special is that they're often secluded and well hidden. They can sometimes be visible only from very near the site. They can be very near routeways and roads and drove roads because smuggling depends on transportation. And they can be very tricky to find. They can also be very tricky to distinguish from other kinds of site, rock shelters, shieling huts, and so on. And indeed, they can be in very close proximity to those, and they can be part of complexes of wider settlement as well. So what sort of evidences am I using? Well, it's a pretty poor smuggler that leaves a paper trail. So it's really been a use of quite official documentation, justice of the peace and sheriff court records. Memoirs and travellers accounts have been very, very interesting and really quite rich in detail sometimes. Parliamentary papers are, again, just a wealth of detail. Whenever there was legislation brought in to tackle illicit distillation, evidences were given to Parliament about how that should be done or why it needed to be done. The Kirk sessions, sometimes surprisingly sparse, when you think there would be a massive interest in drunkenness and the supposed immorality that came with illicit distillation. The statistical accounts and also the general view of agricultures, which were done for each area around 1810. Gager's handbooks, there were not many written, but the ones that are very interesting. And of course, maps and oral history has been a real, just an absolute goldmine of some really quite lovely detail. Many recordings made in the sort of 1950s, and they may be sort of second or even third-hand accounts, but they're closer to the time than many of the accounts we have now. We also have some material culture, which is fantastic. So what we're looking at here are, these are all things from the collection in Newtonmore. On the left, we have, these are glass balls. These are really, really cool. What they are used for is to be inserted into alcohol. And the corresponding, the numbers that you can see just etched into the top of those balls there, they correspond to a strength of alcohol. And that strength would determine how it should be taxed and so on. And I think those are really interesting actually, because they're very neat, they're very small, but they're very transportable. And also they were available to buy openly. So they may not have just been used by gaugers. Those could have been used by distillers themselves to make sure they were getting the right quality of drink. To the right there is a stillworm, an incredibly hefty stillworm, which is where alcoholic vapors would have condensed as they were being distilled, and they would have emerged from the bottom of that as spirit. It looks almost like a car spring. It's very chunky. And it probably comes from this. This is a still held in Newtonmore. It's rather battered. It's been very heavily repaired. Interestingly, the ends of these line arms on the stills have actually been smashed intentionally and could possibly have been decommissioned when they were discovered being used or being possessed. There are two heads that go on this still, which I think is really interesting. The head on the left there has two arms, and the one in the middle has one. And what that probably relates to is different stages of the distilling process. So the distilling process is essentially turning a type of a beer, an unhopped beer, into a spirit by boiling and condensing. It's that simple. Well, it's not actually. There are more stages, but that's essentially it. And that first stage of the process, I could well have utilised that still head on the left as greater quantities of the wash, that's the beer substance, would have been distilled. And then that middle one could have been used in the slightly more delicate process of refining that spirit in its second distillation. So we've got these material evidences as well as the documentary ones. And then there's also the archaeological record. I've got this picture on the right here to show you just how invisible some sites are. And this one, I don't think I would have found this one if I hadn't known it was there. It's essentially dry stone revetments by a bank forming a chamber. The wall, which would have been freestanding, has collapsed inwards. I expect in an act of decommissioning. But yeah, an incredibly hard site to find. So when I go to these sites, I record them through extensive note-taking and sketching, and occasionally through a measured plan being made. So a slightly more satisfying example of a illicit distilling bothy is this one in Strathconnan. This is one that Nos has found, and it's very close to an east-west route from the west coast down to Keswick. And in fact, in the old statistical account, there is a rhyme given by the contributor who talks about the use of this road. He said, from Castle Strom there is a road straight down to Keswick Ferry, and along the road this men of Skye do all their whisky carry. Well, that road runs within 500 meters of this site, and it's quite large, formally appointed. It's about 8 meters, 8 meters long, about 3.5 meters wide, and it would have been roofed with crux, which is quite unusual for a distilling bothy. It was certainly very substantial. It's also near to a former shilling group, and a very important perspective on this site is this. The approach to it is you can see it's very well hidden. You can just see a little bit of dry stone peeping out. But actually, if that had been roofed with a heather thatch, I'm prepared to bet that would have been near impossible to see. And here is another drawing of one of these sites. This is quite near to that one in Strathconnell, just down the road, Alt Vicfadden. And I quite like this picture because it shows the some of the features of a distilling site quite well. It's almost like a textbook example. There's a clear hearth in this one, next to a dip in the wall, and often in primary sources you hear about dips in walls or holes in walls, and in my experience, you don't actually find them very much. And what they would have been used for, if they were there, would be for taking water into a site, cold water, for cooling a still worm and condensing spirits. So there is a very visible dip in this one. But it's nice to be able to demonstrate that in a picture, because often I don't find them. But there are better examples over in Wester Ross. There's some sites that were reported, I think, by Cathy Dagg, and there's really pronounced well-made holes in the walls to conduct pipes through. But these bothies, they actually present a little bit of a problem sometimes. One of these problems is that in my archival research, I've found that they might not all have been illicit. If they're actually near a head dike, I think it's quite likely they would have been legally sanctioned by landowners. I found an agreement from Barcaldine, which stipulated that stills should be built by a head dike. And it also had some really interesting stipulations about how much was to be made, where the grain was to have come from to be made into whiskey, and also who could buy that. Specifically, no servants of Balcardian House were allowed to buy it. And it's also worth remembering that before the Wash Acts in the 1780s, it was perfectly legal to distill in small stills of about 10 gallons capacity. So some of these bothies may actually represent legitimate activity, and we need to consider the position of these bothies in the landscape. But I think where they occur very close to dwellings, there is a chance that the bothy might actually represent legal distilling, but not the ones I just showed you in Strathconnell. I think those were pretty cut and clear illicit sites. You also get some far more ambiguous sites. This one on the left was reported to DES by Stephen Birch in 2019. And it's essentially just a hearth cut into a peat bank, and it's been interpreted as a illicit distilling site. And unfortunately, I haven't been there yet. I would like to go. And again, another site reported to the Highland HER in the 1990s is a small hearth, a sort of a flue feature built in a cave over near Cuig. Again, I haven't managed to go to that one, unfortunately, but there's a variety there of sites where people are distilling, and they may not necessarily be using a bothy. And the next picture is illustrative of this, and a sort of a tension in the archaeological record that these structures can be very small. This is a site up in Glencoilty. I'm afraid I hadn't had time to digitize this picture for you yet, so it's you're getting my sketch. And this is it's only 1.4 meters across. It's tiny, and you wouldn't have distilled in it. But you could well have distilled outside it, beside this burn. And it's well known locally as an illicit distilling site, and I do tend to set store by local knowledge when it goes to this comes to this topic. So my theory is that that size of a site would actually be used possibly for maturing wash in the beer that would then be made into whiskey. Because obviously distilling is a fairly short part of the operation, but making wash, that can take days. And if it gets rained in, then you're scuppered, basically. And then another example of variety. This is near Applecross. I was there with my fiance last week, and this is actually a cave that's way above the tide line, so it must be a very old place. But this is a modern wall in this cave, and it's known locally as the contraband spot. And if a local person is to be believed that I was talking to, was used in the filming of Whiskey Galore, the film. So layers of heritage there. But there's no accounting really for the variety of archaeological material relating to distilling. We're certainly getting loads of different types of illicit distilling sites in the Highlands, including this picture here is of a sort of semi-subterranean site. So we're not just talking about these long rectangular bothies. We're talking about small little hideaways for wash. We're talking about very cleverly hidden subterranean sites. And we're also talking about these storage sites, which is what was in that cave. And also this illicit industry wasn't just about distilling whiskey. There were other aspects to it. Certainly moving the contraband was integral, but also there was the manufacturing supply of malted barley. And I'm afraid the sort of crucial bit of this hasn't really come out in the picture, but this is a small bothy in Glenlivet near Scallon, and right beside it, scarped into the hillside, there's a tiny little malt kiln. So there's also potentially an industry in moving illicit, untaxed malt, which is another element of this industry to consider. Some of the historical evidence talks about people malting illicitly, and then a lot of it talks about people bringing in malt to illicit distilling sites. So sometimes barley may have been malted at the site, sometimes it may have been brought in, and we don't know, or I simply don't know how much of that malted barley was legitimately made. But I expect there was probably a mixture. And then we also get these licensed distilleries. If Eric Grant is there, he'll recognize the picture on the right, which he showed me last year, of a distillery right beside his house. And then on the left, there's another distillery. And what these are part of farms or big houses. So it's particularly important after 1823 as a sort of a satellite industry to farming. It provides farmers with draft to feed their cattle, that's spent grain, and also potail, which could possibly be used as a sort of fertilizer. So distilling is a very good way to run your farm because you get to use your own barley to convert it from a sort of a low value, high bulk material into a high value and low bulk material, and then you can sell something other than just barley from your farm. And we excavated one of these. I excavated one of these with the Cabric Trust last year, and we got some really cracking finds out of it. Actually, we've got there the neck of an earthenware bottle, and we've got a clay pipe that came out right in the top of the layers, and also a barrel band from what looked like a barrel run. And I'm aware I'm running out of time. So just to very quickly show you, this is a model of what that site looked like, that distillery. And it was a very interesting site to work on, because we were able to see the ways that that legislation had been adhered to in the design and construction of this site, including a sort of a closed off area at the bottom for the spirits to emerge from the still worm, almost like a spirit safe, like you find at a distillery in the modern day. That was a sealed off area, and also a vent running right through to the bottom of where the still would have been located, around here. You can see my pointer, the middle of the building, and that depression is where a still would have been located. So I hope I've given you an idea of the sort of variety in these sites and the evidences that we use. I'm afraid I was a little rushed there, but I hope I've given you a good idea of the sort of archaeology there is surrounding this, and some of the historical sources that you can use to investigate it. I'll just finish by saying thank you for being invited, and also thank you to my supervisors, Jane Downs, Elizabeth Ritchie, and Piers Dixon, and also to the European Social Research Fund and the Scottish Funding Council, who funded this research. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Darroch. Thank you for coming, really, I should say. There is a question for you, if you'd be good enough. Mm-hmm. And it says, actually, very good question. What methods were used to hide the smoke from the illicit stills?
Pardon me. This is a really good question, actually. And it's one that I'm getting a little bit obsessed with at the minute. So some of the historical articles around illicit distilling talk about the use of juniper as a smokeless fuel. And I don't think that is a smokeless fuel. I'm actually going to be doing an experiment with some juniper in a couple of weeks to test that. So I think that actually had smoke, and that was probably more about flavoring the spirit. But there are archaeological evidences, especially at the subterranean still I showed you there, that had a sort of it was called a smoke away by the archaeologists that excavated it, where smoke was distributed horizontally along the ground, rather than rising straight from a sort of a stack or from the heather thatched roof. Absolutely no idea if that would have worked, sort of distributing it horizontally. My feeling on this, and this is not a sort of a scientific opinion, but my feeling on this is that actually what we know about the fuel that was actually used, from mainly from oral history, is that it was generally peat. It's not an immensely smoky fuel anyway. So I'm not sure if people would have been very concerned about smoke. But if they were, actually the location of the sites themselves might have been quite important, because they tend to be situated kind of over a lip, and a little bit set back. So I'm not even sure if you were in the bottom of a glen, if you would have been able to see smoke rising, or if it would have been just out of view. But yeah, there are different sorts of conjecture about that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I've got a comment here from maybe something. This is something that happened as well back in the 1800s. But saying that from Anna Esteroth, that my uncle and father made whiskey illicitly in the 1940s, and they used to burn old socks to disguise the smell. So there you go. That's one way of doing it. And a question here from Jill. How many people would have been involved in any one community? Would it be a still per township, or were they shared between townships?
Yeah, that's a really important question too. And well, I think you would have been hard pushed, especially in that period between the 1780s and the 1820s, to have found really anyone that wasn't involved in some way, either as a producer or a consumer, who wasn't involved some way in the illicit industry. each sort of operation, I expect, would have involved a few people, and we've got plenty of evidence of people forming cooperatives to go in and buy a still together. So you may well have had, groups of sort of 5 or 10 people owning a still, and with these like little wash shelters that I was showing you there, I imagine what's actually happening there is people are maturing wash at those sites, and having different batches of wash maturing and fermenting throughout the landscape, and moving stills between them. So each still could have actually serviced a few different operations. So I think you'd probably have a couple of families at least in a township involved, and certainly in some precognitions about the deforcement of excise officers, it's absolutely clear that everybody wants the excise officers to fail in enforcing the taxation, because they get mobbed and deforced quite regularly. So I think in terms of people being producers, consumers, or otherwise supporters, pretty much everyone, or a big majority of people, were involved in the illicit whiskey industry in some way or another.
Okay. I have a quick question. On the back of the really lovely picture you showed of the gauger's balls, how do they work?
I don't know. I have it on good authority that they do. I think just like a normal hydrometer will involve moving sort of alcohol, like glass and alcohol, in accordance with its strength. So it'll. I don't know if hydrometers float, but yeah. So what would have happened is they would have put a couple of the balls in, and the one that it would either be the one that floated or the one that sank. And I've not been lucky enough to use them yet, because I've got some new make spirit that I really want to use them on, but I haven't convinced anyone to lend me their balls yet. So that will hopefully happen before too long. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure exactly how they were used, but that's certainly what they were made for. And they have these very nice little instructions on the back of them, so I can go back and look at that picture and see if they specify if it's about floating or sinking. But yeah.
Fab. Okay. We've got time for a couple more questions, I think. Just on those gaugeables, Alan Winchester says specific gravity glass beads, they were called, and Jill gauges balls like the glass balls in the temperature column decorations. Yeah, so I guess it's how they react, isn't it, differently? So another couple of quick questions. Got one from Norman Newton. In my local history researches in 19th century newspapers, I often note in passing accounts of excise raids, trials, and so on. Have you used these records at all?
Yeah, and it's actually it's been very valuable because obviously we've got really good newspaper archives. So it's been good for tracing when there have been sort of blips of smuggling activity starting to increase again, particularly in the 1850s and the 1880s. There seems to be another frenzy again for distilling, for illicit distilling. And there are often references to that happening. In Russia, it's especially mentioned in Russia in the Dundee and Cooper Advertiser. It always seems to get a mention. But yeah, and it often goes into quite a lot of detail about how much wash was discovered, what was taken away, how many people were there. So really very useful information in those.
Okay. And a question from Owen Brady. You mentioned malt being brought into the sites in some cases, as well as others, where the malt was produced at the distillery site itself. And he's wondering what the grinding process for the malt was like, what sort of quernstones or milling apparatus was used, and if any of this has actually turned up in material finds.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, there haven't been many excavations. And I mean, I know actually Alan Winchester, who commented, a little while ago, is doing a project with the National Trust for Scotland that I believe is going to include some excavation of illicit distilling sites, which is brilliant. I expect we're looking for, I expect it's sort of portable hand querns, or people bringing in already ground malt. But I'm not sure, and some excavation would hopefully answer that question.
Okay. Going to just throw in one last question because we have a hand up from Eric Grant. So I'm just going to ask Eric to come in and ask his question, if you could, Eric.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Darroch, in the map you showed of Tarradale House and the distillery is built right over the stream, above the stream. I mean, how does that work in terms of cooling the worm?
I expect you would have had water running through in two places, basically. You often see leads coming in at ground. Well, you hear of leads coming in at ground level, especially there's a site in Glen Affric where it's very visible. Now that has no value in cooling a worm tub, so you'd have to be bringing water in above the worm tub as well, unless you had a absolutely bizarre contraption that was, had the still worm in at a very low level. But yeah, I think the water coming in under the distillery there, that could be for driving a piece of machinery, maybe for grinding something, or for pumping something. But yeah, the water for cooling the worm would come in at a slightly higher point in the site.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Right. Well, thank you very much, Darroch. That was fascinating. We are going to move on now. So we're on to our second talk, which is, and I hope I pronounced this right, Jasmijn Sybenga. Apologies if I didn't. And she will be talking to us about Seeing the Woods for the Trees, a palaeoecological investigation of native woodlands to inform present and future woodland conservation management strategies in northern Scotland. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Quite the title. And you pronounce it like Jasmijn Sybenga, but that's pretty different. So you
miles away then.
Yeah. But good to see so many people participating. That's very nice. And thank you for your talk, Darroch. I will just share my screen quickly. All right. Is the screen visible?
It is, yep.
And also already in the slideshow, is it?
In the slideshow, yep. That's
great. So in this talk, I will present a distilled version of my research, just to stay in Darroch's terminology, sorry. Yeah, and I will just start off. All right. So for this study, I looked at 3 sites in northern Scotland, and they're all located in the Flow Country, which is one of the largest and most intact areas of blanket bog in the world, and the largest expanse of blanket bog in Europe. The 3 sites that I looked at are Rowans and Bray in the top. They're both located in Caithness. And you have Darroch, it's located in Sutherland. And these areas have been extensively covered with non-native coniferous plantations during the 1980s and early 1990s. And this is still visible today. As you can see here, you see these plantations cutting through the landscape. And these plantations, they have affected the landscape and the present ecosystem drastically. And over the last few years, the plantations have started to be felled in order to reinstate peatlands, as peatlands are now recognized for their value because they're very efficient for terrestrial carbon storage, and healthy peat regulate water runoff, and they can contribute to flood mitigation. And healthy peat also supports a specialized biodiversity. And as an addition to these reinstatements of the peatlands, the Scottish Forestry, with whom I'm working with, they are very keen on developing policies on the reinstatement of the natural woodland in these areas. So to show you a bit better what these areas look like, I have a little video. And yeah, it's starting. So this is the Flow Country, one of the study sites. You will see it in a moment. So extensive peatland areas. And in the back where you see the forest plantation is the site of Rowans, the most northerly of my sites. So in order to find out what this natural woodland would have been in these areas, as you can see, there are no natural woodlands at the moment. And the Forestry Commission or the Scottish Forestry want to reinstate these natural woodlands. But if there's no example of natural woodlands, we have to investigate. I had to investigate what these natural woodlands would have been like. And in order to do so, I cored the 3 areas that I just talked about, like I'm doing here. And the cores that I took were over 6 meters long. And I extracted the pollen grains that were trapped within to see what trees were growing in the landscape in different times. So these are some examples of the pollen grains that I encountered. So yeah, just to show you what it looks like more or less. So on the left, you see Scots pine, and then birch, hazel, willow, alder, elm. And so those are all tree species. But on the right, you see ripwort plantain, which is quite important for well, maybe for archaeologists as well, because when this pollen grain is present, it's often linked to people being present in the landscape as well. So let's continue. Wait. So different research questions were addressed in this study. And the main one was, what woodlands or natural woodlands were present in the past in northern Scotland. And how does this relate between different areas in the north, and how do they change over space and time? So this is quite a big diagram, and I will just quickly explain a little bit of it. If you can see the mouse, yeah. So Rowans is this little diagram, and then you have Bray in the middle and Dalkirk on the right. This diagram shows a time scale from 11,000 years ago until in the top is now, and it shows woodland communities that
come out of it and rejoin it. It sometimes works. It's sorts.
Was there someone that wanted to ask a question? Or was just
I think it was somebody with their microphone on, but don't worry, just carry on.
Okay. Just a little bit of water. Okay, so on the right, you see different woodland communities. And the interesting thing is that although there are different areas in northern Scotland that I looked at, the types of trees that developed over time are quite similar. So you see that in the earliest phase of when trees migrated into northern Scotland, you see that there is a presence of birch and willow in a quite wet environment. And that develops when hazel comes into the landscape, and then pine comes into the landscape. So you really see a variation of trees coming in the landscape, growing together. And around 7,000 years ago, alder becomes present in the landscape, and there are different patches of woodland around, which can be similar to present-day woodlands. So, for example, woodlands that consisted mainly of birch and pine and hazel are possibly related to present-day upland birch woodlands. But I won't go in more detail now. So you did see, I'm just going back 1 second. So you do see that in the first half of the diagram that there's quite a high presence of trees. It's indicated by the higher line of these woodland species here. And suddenly you see that the trees are declining. And so one of the questions is, and also we see today that there are not many trees present. So what caused this decline of trees? And there are often two causes identified for this decline, which are the anthropogenic impact on the landscape. So people in the landscape utilizing woodland present, but it can also be a natural event or like past climate change that influenced these woodlands over time. So people in the landscape there were people in the landscape, we know that for sure, because at all research sites there's a lot of archaeological evidence ranging from Mesolithic times to post-medieval. And for example, here at Rowans, you see that the Kempster cairns are located quite closely to it. The Kempster cairns are here, so people were definitely present between this time in the landscape, probably utilizing the landscape around them and living it and using present woodland. And you also have Brochs, you have these two examples here, and Mesolithic flint working sites have been found with microliths like these in close to the research site. And at Braar, you again find a lot of all the red dots are archaeological finds or archaeological features. Most of them are post-medieval, but again, there's also some Neolithic presence, or a lot of shieldings, which is post-medieval, and henge structures. A lot of archaeology in the area. So you would assume that, yeah, people were using the landscape. And then in the last site, Darroch, again, different archaeology present. Again, cairns and a lot of hut circles. So would these people have influenced the landscape? That's the big question. Or is it something else that that caused the woodland to decline in these areas? So I won't really go over this diagram in detail, but I will just talk you through a little bit. So again, you see the time scale, 11,000 years ago until now. And I've identified the possible presence of different cultural groups in these areas by looking, for example, at an increase in charcoal, because where people are, they are using fires for cooking, or opening up patches of woodland to attract animals for game, or game animals. Sorry. So, for example, there is a high increase in charcoal here. Although, wait, I have to tell you that an increase in charcoal can also relate to natural fires, of course. So often, a steady increase, or a clear increase in charcoal can relate to the presence of people, but also, as I said before, like the pollen grains of ripwort plantain can indicate people present in the landscape. So Mesolithic people it's difficult to really detect whether they were present in the landscape or not. As for example, for the ripwort plantain is often not really present at this time, because there is cereal grains, for example, which are also very indicative for people being present. There were no cereal grains at this time. So Mesolithic activity is difficult to detect, but can be related to an increase in charcoal, which might be seen at Rowans at this time. At Braar, possibly here, because there is some increase in ripwort plantain, but it's really difficult to for certain say that this is Mesolithic activity. And for Darroch, it's here that there is a high increase in charcoal, which might be related to people present in the landscape. It is at this times that you do see a slight decline of trees. So maybe they were utilizing woodland in the area. And then again, you see the presence of Neolithic activity, and well, I will go in more detail in another diagram, a bit more a zoom of this previous diagram. So, one moment. What we see here is that you would assume that when people are present in the landscape and they are using trees, that trees will decline. And this diagram shows that in the purple arrows is where there's a high presence of charcoal, so a possible presence of people. There's a decline of woodland taxa. So here that occurs here and at the end of the site. So this is an example of Braar. But with the green arrows, it's where people are in the landscape. There's an increase of woodland. So this would say that although people were present in the landscape, they were not utilizing the trees that much that made them decline. So they might have been managing the trees in the area. And also this diagram shows that trees were already declining before people were possibly present in the landscape to begin with. So it is maybe likely that there are other reasons for woodland to decline in these areas. And the bottom diagram shows that one specific type of shrub, the hazel, again, that when people are in the landscape, you can assume that they are using hazel shrub for building or they use the hazel, and trees would decline or shrubs would decline, which happens with the purple arrows again. But with the green arrows, you see that actually the hazel shrubs or hazel presence is increasing when people are present in the landscape. This is possible. It's possible related to the coppicing of hazel trees. So the coppicing of hazel trees is still occurring today, and with coppicing trees, they probably can the shrubs will yield more nuts, so hazelnuts. So this might be a good technique to improve the hazelnut yield and also improve timber and utilize the coppice shrubs. All right. So yeah, that's quite interesting. So it actually looks like that people knew how to use the remaining trees in the area. But so still we don't know what it was that made trees or woodlands decline in the first instance. So I will show you what can be some theories about this. So in the past, there have been a lot of different natural events that might be related to the decline and increase of woodland taxa. And this is just a really big diagram with a lot of examples. There have been climatic events like the 10.3 Ka event, but I won't go in detail about those. And for example, volcanic eruptions might be linked to the decline of trees. But I will give one example in what I think that relates to this first major decline in woodland in northern Scotland for some of my sites. So here you see the 8.2 event. Sorry, 1 second. So this event has been recognized throughout Europe and has been related to drier winters and shorter and colder summers and increased windiness. And you see that during this event, birch and hazel. So during this event, you see that at Rowans, there is a major decline in birch trees and hazel trees. And this has also been visible in Darroch, where it declines here. So I think that these past climatic events can be linked to, major decline of woodland in these areas. So what can we do with this information? How can we use this information about past woodland development in perhaps future woodland conservation? So this is a nice little overview. So predictions are that in 2080 to 2099, temperatures in this area of northern Scotland will increase slightly. The whole of Scotland temperature will increase, but like this specific area will only increase with about 1 to 2 degrees annually. And precipitation will also increase a little bit. So in these past climatic events, there are also events that it wasn't colder, but there are periods that are also there are warmer periods as well. So for example, you have the mid-Holocene maximum, and this event has been recognized to be 1 to 2 degrees warmer, and an increase of precipitation has been recorded in Scotland as well. So this occurred around 6,300 before present. So if we look at what woodland was present at that time, we can see that it was that alder trees were present, hazel, pine, and birch. So if we want to bring back natural woodland in these areas, it might be an idea to look at kind of the same situation as in the past. And would it still be possible to plant these trees in these areas? So these diagrams show the suitability of upland birchwoods, which is part of this combination that was recognized in these diagrams, and the suitability to still grow presently grow native pine woods in the areas in northern Scotland. And you can see that it's still possible to have these trees, these woodland present. So it might be an idea to focus on these tree species to continue to grow in these areas. If we want to promote natural woodland development, we should target these woodland species. So a link from the past to the future is what we might need for future conservation management. And that's my talk. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Oh, nice picture to finish there. Was that the next picture? That's very good.
Yeah, that was not meant to be, but it's all right.
No, it is really interesting showing that link between what was and what could be in the future, especially now as we're sort of almost come full circle and looking to reintroduce native species back into our landscapes where those trees have been lost. And it's gone right up the political agenda, of course, in terms of actually, putting native woodlands back in. And this is presumably going to this research will help feed into that in terms of the species mix and making sure those species are resilient. Out of interest, ribwort plantain, it's a very good food for tortoises. But how does it help you identify where human activity has been? What is it about plantain that indicates human activity?
So it indicates disturbed ground. It indicates grazing presence. So where people are, especially in the past, there is a lot of cattle grazing, sheep grazing, and it's they call it like a treading plant. So it means that where people or cattle or livestock are walking and disturbing the ground, they will spread this plant. And you also see this today. You still see the plant on places alongside the road, so places where there's human activity. But also you always have to be a bit wary because there can be a few grains already very early on in the Holocene, and they are not necessarily linked to people, but just to disturbed soils. So the combination often with the charcoal and other human indicator species, there are more, but I only highlighted one in this talk, will tell you that that's most likely that there were people present in the landscape.
And sorry, another one from me. But what indicates in the pollen record? What indicates increased windiness? What is it about the pollen record that suggests there's more wind?
Yeah, so I that's not something that I could see in my research. That's information from a different research that looked into sand dune development. I think this specific one was in Orkney, so I didn't look at that. It's just that I mentioned that because that's one of the characteristics of this 8.2 Ka event that has been there in the past. So okay. It would be nice if you can identify windiness in your pollen records, but no, pretty sure that's not possible.
Okay. I did wonder. I thought that was quite clever. Okay, I'm going to go to the chat. We've got some questions in the chat. So we're going to start with the first one I think that came in, which is asking, with the potential Mesolithic activity increased charcoal in the landscape, it almost appears that there is a sort of a south to north gradient with earlier presence in the south. And is this a pattern observed in the archaeological evidence during this period as well? It's a good question. Very good question.
Definitely, you definitely see further south earlier presence of Mesolithic activity. But and the second part of the question was, sorry, what was the second part? You can see it in
is it a pattern observed in the archaeological record?
The annoying thing is that all archaeological features close to my study sites aren't dated, like the early ones are not dated to a specific time, and there is hardly any Mesolithic archaeology around, so it's really difficult to determine where the earliest presence is because there's just hardly any evidence left.
Yeah.
Well, I would assume that it should be nice to link it. But the nice thing of this type of research is that you can still possibly see that people are in the landscape, although there is no archaeological evidence. So that is quite nice that it adds to the story, and it might show where the people were first before there is archaeological evidence.
There's a very nice roundhouse that's just, I think, just finished being excavated. Obviously, too late for your period, but at Darroch at the forest there,
very nice.
It's a really good one. It's a cracking piece of work. There is a comment from Jill just saying that there's a Reforesting Scotland Facebook group that would love to hear about this. And I think in terms of future planting, I really do think there's an awful lot of potential to make use of this kind of research. I think it's definitely something that people who are looking to reforest should be looking at. And the question here, will these species survive with future climate projections? Presumably the species that could potentially go back into the ground that you've discovered from the Mesolithic.
Yeah, so I highlighted a little bit because, of course, the woodlands developed over time. So I tried to show that perhaps the times that it was a little bit warmer than today, which there are some periods that it was warmer than it is today already. Those times, the woodlands present in those times might be suitable or are probably suitable for future climatic predictions. And especially this northeastern area where my research is located, it seems that the least change is going to happen here. So yeah, arguably it's very, very suitable to replant those tree species. Although you always should take in mind that the peatland area should be kept most intact. So not on the predominantly peatland areas where the woodlands should develop, but on the margins of the peatlands. Or that's what you should target.
Yeah, well, as you were talking, it was quite interesting, the areas that you are looking at, the areas that are starting to be brought into the prospective World Heritage Site for the Flow Country for its peat interests, sort of thing. Don't plant on the peat.
Yeah.
But no, absolutely on the outskirts. I think there's huge potential to certainly native species.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, possibly two, because I've just seen another one come in. This is from Althea Davies. It's great to see more pollen data from the region. Do you have any sense of woodland density? And was this a scrubby or open growth, or were there pockets of a denser canopy?
All right. So I think especially the most southern side, so Darroch, was most likely more dense. In this type of data, it's very difficult to detect how dense woodlands were, but it does appear that there have been periods that woodlands were more dense, especially when pine came into the landscape. It looks like there and birch has like very high quantities of pollen grains. It's still, it's difficult to detect how dense woodlands were, but I do think that there were short periods that it was quite dense, and most of the periods was quite open and spread out, and pockets of woodland, and especially along rivers or in more sheltered area where hazel could thrive better. So yeah, it is difficult to detect, but I do think that there were some periods of more dense woodlands.
Okay. Question from Ann Coombs: will peat survive the warming?
Yeah, maybe you should ask my partner who's also listening, and he does the peatland research.
Okay. And then last one, quite an interesting one. What about all the animals which are no longer there? What would that affect the growth of the forest in the future? And I suppose conversely, what about all the additional deer that we have now? Yeah. Is that going to affect trees as they become planted now?
Yeah, of course. So that I highlighted a little bit in my PhD thesis, but not during my talk. But deer populations is a big problem. Like you see areas that have been fenced off, that actually natural regeneration is happening. So that does tell you that once you exclude deer population or deer within a woodland area, woodland is managing to grow by itself. You don't have to plant it, so minimum intervention. So yeah, but how to go around that? That's a difficult question. Like you can't fence everything off. So who knows, maybe bring back some other predators for the deer. But yeah, I find it very difficult, because if you want to plant trees or if you want to recreate these natural woodlands, you have to have a solution for the deer population densities.
Yeah, and deer management can be quite a hot topic or an emotive topic. So,
yeah, definitely. Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was great. We're going to move on. No, you're very welcome. We're going to move on to our final talk of the evening. So this is Hannah Geddes-Boyd, and she's going to be talking on the subject of her talk is Out of the Round, a palaeoecological investigation into human environmental interactions of hut circle communities in Gairloch, Wester Ross. And Hannah's going to be looking at some of the hut circles that Anna Welty has spoken to us about in the past at past HAF conferences that were discovered as part of the Weed Digs project. So over to you, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Brilliant. So I'll just share my screen now. Hopefully that will work. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Excellent.
Everyone else can.
Well, we'll bank on it. Hi, I'm Hannah, and I'll finish off this session by telling you a little bit about the Out of the Round project, which is a research master's that I'm currently working on with supervision from the University of Highlands and Islands, Aberdeen and St Andrews. I'm now 8 months into this project, which is a paleoecological investigation into human environment interactions in Bronze and Iron Age hut circle communities of Gairloch, which is quite a mouthful. But essentially, I'm interested in getting a little snapshot of the relationship between the communities that created those roundhouses and the environment in which they lived in. So just to give you a little bit of background to this project, understanding where it's come from, it's grown out of hut circle research in the Northwest Highlands. And as Andrew said, they're largely out of the Weed Digs project, which many of you will kind of know about already, but for those of you who don't, this is a project led by Anna Welty, with a community who've surveyed hut circles all across the Wester Ross region, and have now added about 400 new hut circles to our knowledge of that area, which is showing that this is a really significant monument type. But still hasn't actually been researched as much as we would like, and certainly there has been quite limited application of palynological study or pollen analysis and paleoenvironmental study to our understanding of these hut circles. So this project offers an opportunity to get a better understanding of those communities and of the kind of population changes or the population potential fluctuations that were going on as they were being built and used over time. Particularly in the Gairloch area is because the Weed Digs group undertook some excavations of those roundhouses and others back in 2012. And the Gairloch excavations turned up some radiocarbon dates, and there was a preliminary palynological analysis as part of that, which showed that this would be a useful area to do some further study on. So this project aims to create a long-term landscape record to put those shorter sequences into context, which will give us a better understanding of local woodland and exploitation of resources, and hopefully give us an understanding of what these monuments represent in the landscape. So whether these represent like a large and continuous population, or episodes of abandonment, episodes of rebuilding. Kind of get a sense of what we're looking at in the environment there. And with that, this is a relevant topic to be looking at just now, because those hut circle communities and economies aren't particularly well understood. So this is a good chance to look at that a little bit closer. The reason for focusing in on this end of the Bronze Age period, these roundhouses have a huge longevity in the landscape, but this area at this time at the end of the Bronze Age is a period of known climatic change, one of those times that Jasmine mentioned in her talk as well. And so what I'm interested in looking at is how communities there would have responded to that kind of climatic change, and whether we see any evidence of resilience or adaptation in that period. And that feeds into some current academic debates about upland settlement and abandonment, and how people responded to that. And that's obviously an interesting thing to be thinking about in the context of current climatic changes, particularly in northwest Scotland, which the climate is changing at a faster rate than the rest of Scotland, that the rainfall is increasing at a higher rate and things like this. So it's maybe some interesting context there. And this project is also fulfilling some of the original aims of the WEDIX project. So it's very much still a part of that ongoing project, still very much following into that, or feeding into that rather. So this is some of the WEDIX groups themselves showing me around the hut circle site. You can see there saying that there's climatic change going on. I think I got there on just about the most beautiful day of the year, but gives you a good sense of what that landscape looks like just now.
Oh, Hannah, I think sorry, Hannah, I think your slides have disappeared. We have a sort of a little toolbar instead. I don't. It may just be me. No, it's not somebody. It's not just me. I think somebody. I think I know why. Alistair Cameron. I think you may have accidentally shared your screen.
Oh dear.
Oh, do we know how to unshare?
Maybe if I share again.
Somebody's screen. That might be. Yeah, try that.
Is that back up?
Yes, brilliant. You just need to start your PowerPoint presentation again. Fantastic. You're back on.
Back up. Fab. Okay. So that's the kind of site that we're looking at now. So yeah, to zoom in a little bit closer, this is the area that we're talking about in particular. So on the left there, that's a map showing Darroch. In the middle there, that's the Axcairn area where the hut circles I'm particularly interested in, and the landscape that I've taken or I'm sampling the pollen from. And the image on the right there gives an indication of just how many hut circles are already we're already aware of in that landscape. It's an awful lot. So of the roundhouses, the hut circles that have already been excavated by the WEDIX group, this is one of them. This is Axcairn 3, where the outer wall turn back a Middle Bronze Age date, although there is evidence of some late Neolithic activity there as well. And this is Axcairn 2, which showed a late Bronze Age date. And this also gives you a nice indication of the setting of these roundhouses. Here we're looking kind of northwest out to the sea. We're looking down to Darroch township there. And from the kind of top of this ridge, you can see a lot of the other roundhouse sites in the region. So they really are kind of peppering the landscape here. So just to touch back into the research questions that have come out of the WEDIX project and out of this area, out of this landscape in general. When I'm talking about human environment interactions, what we're talking about is how humans were affected by a changing climate, and those questions of resilience, and these questions of changes in population, changes in occupation through time. And we're also interested in how humans affected their environment. Question? Oh, I've got an echo, that's what it is. Never mind, we'll carry on. So things like land use and the kind of economies of land that were at play, the exploitation of resources like woodlands, and maybe even getting a chance to look at polluter processes like metalworking. So to really see the kind of footprint that humans and communities are leaving on that landscape. So how am I going to manage this? Well, much like Jasmine's project that we just heard about there, I'm also looking at this through pollen analysis. So the evidence comes from a peat core taken a few years ago. And I'll be analysing the pollen, the non-pollen polymorphs, so that's things like fungi and spores, and the charcoal from that core, and then we've also got some radiocarbon dates from that. And that picture on the left shows you what taking a core entails. It's quite a soggy business. But this is the site from which the core was taken, which looks very unsoggy there on that beautifully sunny day, but that is a lovely peat bog there. And this is looking at sort of the Acticairn 2 and 3 are behind us in this, and this whole area again is just surrounded by roundhouses. So this is a really good pollen catchment area for getting a good signal of the activities that were going on in the landscape in this period. And this is some of my data that's come back from that core. Happily, so down on the left-hand column there, you can see those are the samples that have been taken from that core, so every 10 centimetres. The bright yellow indicates the radiocarbon dates that have come back from that core, just come back from Queen's, which is fantastic. And you can see they line up really nicely with the radiocarbon dates that came back from the Acticairn excavations by the Weedix groups. So that's really good news, hooray! That we're looking in the right place, and it's this moment in time at the kind of Bronze to Iron Age transition that I'm going to be particularly interested in. So looking at what this data can tell us, just to put out there for start, this is very raw and very new data. This is kind of an ongoing project still, and this is just a little snapshot, a little snippet of what I've been finding so far. So here we're seeing some of those changes at like going from the early Bronze Age right through to the late Iron Age. And in this chart, I've included the charcoal count, which is not a pollen grain, but when we zoom in a little bit closer, it does give us an opportunity to maybe get a sense of human activity in our landscape through time. So as we start to interpret the data tentatively and a little bit more, we can see things like at 80 centimetres, which is a late Bronze Age moment, late Bronze Age period. We've got a fairly significant increase in the charcoal counts at the same time that the scrub woodland in the region is decreasing, which would suggest maybe a burning event. As Jasmine pointed out earlier, like that could be a natural event. You do get wildfires, but at the same time we've got a little increase in Plantago lanceolata, which is suggesting certainly suggesting human occupation, but maybe suggesting pasture. So this could represent the scrub woodland being taken away, being used as a fuel, being burnt, and maybe being replaced by pasture and by pastoral farming. So that's the kind of thing that we can maybe start to see in this data. So the next step for this project going forward, I'll be looking more at the non-pollen paleomorphs in my sample to kind of support or deny some of those ideas coming through. I'll be taking some further samples from that core to get a closer temporal resolution. You might have seen those 10 centimetre samples do leave some fairly significant gaps in the dating. So we'll be zooming in a little bit closer to get a better sense of the kind of a closer time look to see how the populations are changing or what's happening there. And there might even be potential COVID chaos allowing for some geochemical analysis, which would be an opportunity to look at heavy metals in the peat to see if there is evidence of metalworking in that region. Again, that sort of effect that the human population is having on their local environment there. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And if there's any questions, we can do that just now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hannah. That's great. Brilliant. How many, out of interest, I mean, given that the Weedix project has turned up so many roundhouses and hut circles, how many have you actually cored, and how do you decide which ones to target?
So yeah, that's a good question. Like my core comes from a peat bog that is surrounded by some of those roundhouses. So I'm linking it in particularly to Acticairn 2 and 3. and Arctic 1 as well, actually, because those are ones where there's radiocarbon dates. So it's nice to be able to know that the pollen I'm looking at does match date-wise with the roundhouses. Those roundhouses have, you know, a really long periods of occupation, so there would be potential for that not matching up. So yeah, places that have been radiocarbon dated is always a good one. And this core was taken from that bog in particular because there was a serious depth of peat. So that was actually a 4.2 meter core. Actually, as it turned out, the first 1.5 meters covers my period of interest quite nicely. But having that depth of peat there is really helpful to be able to kind of get a better sense of time depth and stuff. So those are some of the factors that kind of feed into choosing that. Fantastic.
And is the plan to actually sort of widen the net and start looking at other ones in different areas as well, or is sort of the main concentration going to be on that particular group of hut circles?
I mean, this is currently an MRes project, so this will just focus on the Garlock one. Okay. If there were potential, or you know, maybe future PhDs, or that, you know, that kind of, I guess, all dependent on funding and stuff. But yeah, like that would be like such an obvious next step to widen it out, to look at the other WEDIGS groups and do some comparisons between and see what's happening there. Yeah, there's like such a wealth of data, but that also does depend on finding some other nice bogs to call.
Yeah, fantastic. I've got a question here from Sue. Do you have a sense of any change in agricultural practices over time, perhaps more pastoral or sometimes more arable? And does that fit with the periods of occupation?
So that's very much the kind of signals that I'm looking out for in my data. As yet, I'm not able to draw any kind of clear conclusions about those kind of changes happening. But hopefully, as I go to my next stage of sampling and my next stage of counting, that's the kind of thing that's going to be coming through. I mean, as I was saying, there in the late Bronze Age, there's clearly like a huge amount of pastoral farming beginning to happen. It might be that we see a concurrent drop in arable farming or such like, or maybe just, you know, that we might see that arable farming also increases and we've just got a big population increase that needs a lot of food to support it. So that's the kind of, those fun questions will be coming through.
Okay. Another question. How close to the roundhouse sites do you take the cores, thinking amount of charcoal could be biased by proximity to the occupation zone? And just, I suppose we could widen that out slightly as well to the evidence for metalworking as well.
Yeah, so this core, the bog here, the core comes from about, it's about 100 metres downslope from the roundhouses, from Acticairn 2 and 3 roundhouses, where we have the radiocarbon dates for. The charcoal is actually counted in different sizes. For that data, I did just put it all together to give a kind of clearer signal, but we are able to count like larger pieces of charcoal to suggest closer burning and smaller pieces of charcoal that may have come from further away. So yeah, that's the, as we are looking actually at a really close distance from the roundhouses with this core, and within a basin, within a fairly small basin, so quite a nice pollen catchment area and also charcoal catchment area for understanding Acticairn 1, 2 and 3. But that's why it kind of just makes sense to relate this pollen data back to those specific roundhouses and speak quite specifically about those ones to be able to kind of give that kind of clearer image.
Yeah, absolutely. A comment from Giles Carey, formerly of this parish. He says he can see the real benefit of analysis of multiple hut circles in different locations to try and tease out some of the diversity inherent in this monument type. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that as well. I mean, obviously they're very often categorized as if you like almost the same thing. And is this actually is this project going to start to maybe give some more understanding into how different they can be and different uses they might have been put to over time, and especially I suppose if this can be widened out when you start your PhD.
Well, yeah, that's, I mean, it's a really good point. Thank you, Giles. And I think it is worth remembering that like a lot of our understanding of hut circles, even like referring to them as hut circles, it feels like we're such, you know, we're we're quite new to all of this. Like it hasn't, hut circles as a monument type haven't really been, I think, given their due in the way we've understood them as a discipline and as archaeologists. So hopefully applying paleoecological techniques and getting some really solid palynological data for at least these roundhouses will be a good path towards really starting to understand these monument types a bit more. At least if we get a good sense of, you know, this little snapshot that my project will give of these roundhouses at this moment in time, and then we can open out from there and look at so many more, so much more geographical understanding and temporal understanding, and that would be a wonderful next step.
That's great. Okay, well, I think we've probably come to the end, and we're just approaching 9 o'clock, so perfect timing. And so it just really leaves me to say thank you to our 3 speakers today, and for taking the time to come and talk to us about your research, and wishing you the best of luck, really, as you complete your studies in this slightly traumatic time in which we're currently living. I hope it all goes well. And other than that, I would just like to give a quick plug for what's coming up tomorrow. We only have 3 talks remaining. So tomorrow we have a double bill, which is we've got John McLeod talking about multi-period remains at Ashe Egon Skye. And we have then Susan Cruiser talking about the Highland Regional Scarf Project. So if you haven't booked your tickets, please do. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Otherwise, again, another thank you to our speakers. Brilliant, really enjoyed it. Very inspired to go out and do some coring, actually, and find myself a nice boggy field somewhere. And otherwise, have a lovely evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you.